All right, what I want to talk about finally is yield curves. Someone asked me about this, so I figured I would make this video. Um, I don't want to get too in depth into the subject because it can get pretty complicated. What exactly goes into determining what the shape of a yield curve is and what the yield curve really tells you about the economy and whatnot. Um, but the concept of a yield curve is actually very simple, at least, and that is exactly what is shown here. It is a graph or a chart um, of U.S. government bond yield rates on the y-axis versus maturity times of the bond on the x-axis. And this is the yield rates for January 2nd, 2018. The Treasury's website actually has yield curves for every single day in chart form. And we'll look at today's yield curve later on. And this is typically its normal shape of a yield curve, and that is it's increasing and concave down. I don't want to get into why yield curves are typically concave down. I can't really find any good information on that. It's fairly complicated. But I do want to talk about why normally the yield curve is increasing. And the fact that it's increasing means that the sentiment in the market is that things are going well. It's business as usual. The economy is good. Investments are healthy and good. And why is that? Okay. Well, so even if things are going well, there's always short-term volatility. And there are good reasons why you really would want to avoid short-term volatility. For example, if you are retiring in a year, you might not want to invest in the stock market because even in the best of times, you might hit a downturn in the market, even in the short term. And if that coincides with when exactly you want to retire, you might be screwed. Okay? So in the short term, people often look for very safe investments. And they're willing to put their money in these safe short-term investments, even if they get low yields, because it's safe and it's short-term. You're not locking in money for a long period of time. Okay? And you really don't get safer than U.S. government bonds. On the other hand, in the mid and long term, most people are not okay with low yields. Okay, the stock market in general averages, I think it's like 6 or 7% per year, at least in modern times. Okay, so in that sense, investing in the Dow or the S&P 500 is probably going to get you in the long term way more than a bond. Okay, so in order to make in order for U.S. bonds with long maturities to be attractive, they have to have a sufficiently high yield rate. Now, even though these yield rates are often lower than this average number I mentioned for the stock market, because of its safeness, its security, people are still willing to take fairly low yield rates for long-term maturity bonds, but they still demand a certain yield rate for a long-term bond. And in particular, the longer the maturity time, the higher the yield rate people demand. Really the second reason for that is, well, you're locking up money in this bond that you could have otherwise invested in the stock market. So for those two reasons, that stock market does better on average, and because you're locking up money in this bond, the longer the maturity, the better the yield investors demand. And I should mention that the Fed, largely the Federal Reserve, is largely able to control short-term interest rates, whereas the Fed largely lets the market determine long-term interest rates. And when I say interest rates, I really mean yield rates. So when you say when you hear the Fed cut interest rates, it really means the Fed cut short-term interest rates. Okay. Right, and because, like I said a second ago, the market is what determines long-term yield rates for bonds. And when I say long-term, I mean the yield rate for bonds with large maturity. The market, for the reasons I just mentioned, demands that the longer the maturity, the higher the yield rate. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about inverted yield curves. So what is an inverted yield curve? Well, it's generally a yield curve where short-term rates are higher than mid-term rates. They could also be higher than long-term rates. When I say rates, again, I mean yield rates. Okay. But as long as short-term rates are higher than mid-term rates, you have an inverted curve. And it's largely a sign that things are not going so well in the economy. And you might often read, in news articles that an inverted yield curve has predicted recessions successfully, for the past, 50 years or 100 years. So what's going on, and why is an inverted yield curve indicative of bad times to come? Well, for reasons I mentioned before, still people are okay with low short-term yields. Maybe they're not okay with super duper low short-term yields, but as long as the short-term yields are not too low, people are okay. All right? And I'll discuss what kind of happened here where, for a very short time, a short-term maturity bond, the interest rate went from, the yield rate rather went from like 1.3% to 2%. It has to do with Fed's monetary policy. But in general, still, people are okay with low short-term yields. Now, in the midterm, if people think things will get really bad, then people are okay with very low yield rates. If you think for 5 years the stock market's going to be atrocious, then you're willing to buy a short 5-year bond, for example, with a really low yield rate, right? And you might even be willing to, buy this 5-year bond at a yield rate that is lower than the, the really, really short-term yield rate. Now, in the long term, it's not really clear what is going to happen. It could very well be that you kind of think, well, this isn't so bad. Well, things will turn around, in which case long-term rates determined by the market will go up for the reasons long-term rates determined by the market, long-term meaning long maturity, it's going to increase for the reasons I mentioned before, that, well, even if you're in a recession now, the stock market, you expect to do pretty well in the next 15 years. So you demand a higher yield rate if you're going to buy a long-term bond. On the other hand, if you really expect things to be bad, so bad that between now and, again, for example, 5 years, you're just going to lose a ton of money, you really might be okay with really, really long-term low yield rates. Because even if the stock market does better after 5 years, it's not enough to compensate for the really hellish 5 years you might have had in the stock market. So for that reason, if things really look bad, people might be willing to have really, really low yield rates in the long term, even lower than they would in the midterm. Okay? Now, another reason why a yield curve might invert is because investors might expect the Fed to make a rate cut. Okay, and if the Fed makes a rate cut in the short-term yield rates, well, then people are going to they're not going to want a short-term bond. They're going to want to lock in rates. They're going to want to lock in long-term rates because they're unsure of just how badly these rate cuts are going to be. Okay, so for that reason, you really don't necessarily, you're willing to buy at least a midterm bond for a lower yield rate because you expect rates to get cut, and again, you want to lock in a decent interest rate. Okay. Whereas for a short-term bond, it's there's really there's no need. You really have to be enticed to buy that. And hence the higher yield rate. Okay. Now, why would the Fed? I'll talk about why the Fed would ever want to cut an interest rate later. Okay. And I don't want to get too much into flat yield curves, but flat yield curves are just like what it says. They're fairly flat. They don't really change in terms of maturity time. So, for example, here, this is from actually Bloomberg article. This is the December 4th, 2019 yield curve in blue. So this one in August is definitely an inverted yield curve. But here this is positive sloping, but it's still fairly flat. I mean, the difference between the yield rate for 3-month bonds and the yield rate for 10-year bonds is roughly about 0.3%, which is very little change. Overall, flat yield curves are indicative of uncertainty, caution in the market, and it's very normal for it's very typical for normal curves to kind of flatten out before they completely invert, and conversely, it's often what often happens is inverted yield curves flatten out before they turn back into normal yield curves. But I don't want to get into exactly what sets yield curves flat. It's fairly complicated, but so I do want to talk about really briefly the current yield curve. Okay. And where is that? Right. So you can just go. You can enter into Google or any search engine U.S. Treasury yield curves, and you'll be able to access this. So let's first look at a very typical, normal-looking yield curve, and that was back in January. Interest rates still are fairly low, but it's it doesn't matter when we look, really. but it's still typically this increasing, curve. Okay, it starts at 1.53% and goes up to 2.33%. So it's fairly flat, but it's still increasing. So it's not that much different than the yield curve roughly 2 years preceding it. Okay. On the other hand, let's look at the yield curve today. Let's actually do it today, literally today. So let's go May 7th. And you do see that this is, it is increasing. But you'll notice that these rates here, the short-term rates are just insanely low. Even the midterm rates are ridiculously low. 0.29% for a 5-year bond. Okay? So what on earth is going on here? And why on earth would anyone want to buy a 1-month bond or a 5-year bond for 0.1% or 0.29%? And so, okay, let me first discuss what's going on here. What's going on is the Fed is cutting short-term interest rates, which is largely all it can do to make stocks more attractive. Okay, you make short-term bonds as unattractive as they can be, which makes stocks just more attractive. I mean, you got to invest somewhere. Okay. Now, the long-term sentiment doesn't look like it's particularly good. So people are willing to buy 10-year bonds at 0.63%, which is pretty crazy. And even a 20-year bond at 1%. It's pretty scary, but anyway. Yeah, so that's basically largely what's going on. And you can ask, well, as I mentioned, who's buying these bonds then? The government needs money to function, to do what it does. Bonds are a way for for individuals, corporations, whatever, to lend the government money. How is the government getting money if bonds are largely, at least in the short term, unattractive? The answer is, well, basically the Fed is largely buying its own bonds, at least in the short term, maybe even in the long term. That's what's typically called quantitative easing. Okay? Right. So, right. And so basically it's the Fed buying bonds, which is a little strange, and it kind of sounds a little backwards that the government is buying its own. It's almost like the government lending itself money, which is akin to kind of like printing money, which to some degree is true. But it's interesting to note that inflation, which is always scary when you essentially print money, inflation didn't really creep up all that much when Obama basically did the same thing after the horrible crash of 2008, I believe it was. So it's interesting to think what's going to happen with all these stimulus packages and with this quantitative easing in the future when it comes to inflation. Is all this going to be really bad for inflation? Who knows? That's not for me to really answer. it's a little worrisome, I think, but I mean, I think most people agree. What's the alternative? And so I do want to answer something I raised. So what explains this kind of interest rate hike in the very short term here? Well, as I mentioned, a lot of times the Fed will want to well, so as mentioned, the Fed often wants to lower interest rates to make stocks more attractive. Conversely, if the Fed wants to kind of cool down the economy and make things a little less attractive, particularly the stock market, then the Fed is going to increase short-term yield rates to make them more attractive. And that's exactly what the Fed did in between 2018 and 2019. It raised interest rates to, cool down the economy, to, try and make sure that inflation isn't too high. And I should also mention, when yield rates are really low, government set yield rates, those rates often have a determination and effect on mortgage rates and bank rates, and in particular, they often in turn are low. And when mortgage rates are low, people buy homes. Lending rates are generally lower. People borrow more. So it's essentially freer money, which all, of course, might affect inflation, if unchecked, might allow inflation to get too high. So, so in general, it's the Fed's job to particularly balance, inflation being too high and making sure the economy doesn't deflate and jobs aren't lost. It's a challenging balancing act, but yeah. So right now, inflation, frankly, be damned. It's not my opinion. That's just the general sentiment. Inflation be damned. We're keeping interest rates really, really, really low to really try and, make stocks as attractive as possible. And it's been fairly successful. The stock market's actually doing fairly well in the past few weeks. It's largely rebounded from the kind of disaster few weeks it had. And as I mentioned, lower interest rates means lower mortgage rates, lower lending rates. So, the Fed is doing what it can to keep the economy on life support by making money freer and looser. Long-term effect of that is to be seen. All right, well, that was a little longer than I expected, but hopefully that was informative. And if you want to read up more on anything I mentioned, some good sources are there's some good sources. The Morningstar is a pretty good source for information. Investopedia is pretty good. Actually, the Motley Fool is an interesting website. They all have good commonsensical finance information that would expand on a lot of things I talked about here. So, all right, good luck tomorrow, and stay safe, and maybe I'll see everyone around in the fall or later on.